Okay, thanks. As Ken said, I've been here in Singapore for a while now, about 4.5 years. I worked sort of around the region in Southeast Asia and further afield. And this talk really is to introduce you to some work that I've started doing here in Singapore. And my hope is that in a year's time, I'll be able to give you another talk. You'll be able to come back and hear about what we're actually starting to find out from the research program that I'm starting. So the way I want to do this really is go through initially an overview. For many of you, this will be old hat, but some of you won't. Some basic sort of shark biology, a bit of ecology and why sharks are important in ecosystems around the world. Then talk about, really give a few examples of sharks that have been spotted or caught in Singapore, and maybe talk a bit about the biology of some of them. And then go on to talk to you about some of the techniques that I plan to use to look at sharks in Singapore waters. So basics, okay, real basics here. So sharks are fish, I think. So they're elasmobank fish. Okay, so they're in a group that includes the rays, which are these animals obviously down the bottom here, which I will not be talking about the rest of this lecture, the rest of this talk. And also really important in terms of being endangered and conservation issues, but I'll stick to sharks today. So in terms of sharks, they're found in both marine and freshwater systems. The majority of them are marine systems, although we do find that there are a couple of species that live almost predominantly in freshwater and those that can actually live in estuarine systems and move into freshwater systems as well. An example there would be bull sharks, which if you're in Nicaragua, Lake Nicaragua has a population of bull sharks there. And they're cartilaginous fish. Okay, it's one of the things that separates them from most of the fish in the ocean, the fact that they have cartilage as a skeleton. So cartilage, basically, you think about our skeletons, and we have bone, but that bone is on a framework of cartilage. Now, for the sharks, that bone, over time, they've got rid of it. So they just have a skeleton made of cartilage. The advantage being it's about half the weight, half the density of bone, which means that if you're an animal living in seawater, being less dense means you don't sink quite as quickly. Okay, most fish in the world's oceans have what's called a swim bladder. So it's almost like a balloon inside their body, and they can use that by sort of changing the pressure in it to hover, to have neutral buoyancy in the water column. Sharks don't have that. Okay, so by having this cartilage, it means that they're less dense and they have to expend less energy when they're actually swimming. And they're diverse. Okay, there are over 400 species of sharks in the world's oceans, and they've been here for a long time. Okay, if you look at the fossil record, the record's going back over 400 million years. So sharks are very successful, and they've been around for a very long time indeed. Huge diversity not only of shapes and sizes, but in terms of the kind of habitats they live in. So you have coral-associated sharks. You have sharks that are associated with sandy and muddy bottoms, those that are in rivers and mangroves. So they're really found in most of the world's oceans and coastal areas. So I said they've been around for a long time. Also, some of them live for an extremely long time as well. So this example here, this is a Greenland shark. Okay, some researchers last year over in Denmark were trying to age this species, and what they did is they looked at the lenses in the eyes of these animals, looked at a particular protein in those lenses, and were able to date the animals to extremely long ages. So we're talking, they estimate about 400 years, give or take, and that give or take range is between, what have I got here, 272 and 512 years old. So they've been around a hell of a long time. That was just one individual. So there may be older individuals around there in the world's oceans still. What's even perhaps more astounding is the fact that they don't think they become reproductive until they're about 150 years old. So one of the issues with sharks is the fact that for them being susceptible in terms of fisheries, or that they don't tend to breed until later in life. And so if they're taken out in terms of the fishery, you lose a reproductive population. Imagine with this species, if they're not breeding until they're 150 years old, how susceptible they are to overfishing. Okay, in reproduction. Okay, two sort of main modes of reproduction in sharks. Half of them, well, about 40% of them, sorry, are egg-bearing, what we call oviparous reproduction. They produce eggs. Okay, so here, on the left-hand side here, we have an example of a horn shark. Okay, in the egg cases here, And this shark lives down about 150 meters deep in water in the world's oceans. And its egg case shape enables it to basically wedge its egg case in rock crevices so that it's safe, it stays in one place for the embryo to develop. The one on the right-hand side is the egg case of a bamboo shark. And you see here there's the tendrils on the very end, on the ends here. So what this shark will do is it will swim around seagrass or algae or bits of twig or coral, etc. And as it lays its egg, it also wraps, swims round and round and round, and leaves that egg case there. Now I've got a video of that if it works. Bear with me. The wonders of modern technology. Aha, okay. Is that the right one? Yes. Sorry, let me get my mouse in the right place. Okay, so here we have, you can see this animal swimming round and round, and you see it laying its egg cases and wrapping those tendrils around there. It's a very smart way to have an egg staying in one place, so the embryo is developing in it until it's eventually ready to hatch out. Give birth to live young. There's a variety of different strategies they have for this. Some of them are what we call ovoviviparous, a bit of a tongue twister. They lay eggs, but their eggs actually hatch out internally. So when they're young, they're actually born. So we have a lemon shark here, I think it is. You can see there's the yolk still attached to the animal. Others, the mother produces some sort of secretion in the uterus that the embryos will actually consume for energy. Others, you have the mother producing excess eggs that haven't been fertilized, and the embryos will actually eat those eggs for energy. And you have yet others where the embryos are actually cannibalistic and will eat each other, which I also have a video of. So we have actually inside the female shark that's pregnant and the embryos munching down and consuming each other. So, a fascinating way that these animals are very successful in terms of producing young that have the stamina and the strength, and basically when they're born, they're able to go off and function as an individual unit. Oops. Okay, it's working again. And they're easy to sex. You can easily tell apart a male and a female shark, which makes them great to work on, because a lot of them, in many cases, many species, they're about the same size, they look very similar. So we have on the left-hand side here a male, a male, these are the claspers, which are extensions of their pelvic fins. There are grooves that run down these, deep grooves, and they basically pass packets of sperm along these grooves when they're fertilizing the female. Now, when they get to the female, there are some species that actually can keep those packets without using them in fertilizing their eggs for weeks, months, or even years. And even more fascinating, I suppose, is the fact that now with DNA technology the way it is, and with genetic screening, etc., we're seeing that there are other sharks that undergo what we call parthenogenesis. Okay? And that's basically where you have a female shark giving birth to young, and there has been no male involved at any step of the way. Okay? All the genetic material in that young animal only comes from the mother. So another sort of amazing strategy in terms of survival. And ecology-wise, okay, you may hear the term sort of apex predator or keystone predator bandied around. And the reality is that some of the larger sharks are these apex predators. They're sort of the largest predators in the ecosystem that they're living in. Other sharks are what we call mesopredators. So they're also predators, but there are bigger predators eating them. So basically, mesopredator is basically a predator in the middle. But this image here is from a paper by Roth et al. Last year, where they were looking at the impact of removing sharks from an ecosystem and what that will do in terms of balance in the food web. You have basically something called a trophic cascade where you have predators involved, where if you have predators, they're obviously consuming prey. So the prey species will never go above a certain abundance or will behave in a different way because there's a predator there. Now, once you remove that predator, potentially what will happen is you have an increase in their prey species, and that increase in the prey species, they're obviously feeding on something else, which may then impact the rest of the food web. It's what we call a trophic cascade. Now, people have been looking at this. It's really difficult to prove and really difficult to look at in the field because there's all these other factors happening at the same time. So we're becoming quite reliant on modeling. So this paper here actually looks at computer modeling, where they're looking at, based on the biology and ecology of systems that we know, what happens to a model system in a computer when you remove sharks. One of the reasons it's really difficult to do in reality is because this is really more what a food web actually looks like. So at the top here, we have our apex predators, these grey, well, sort of medium grey circles. You have your mesopredators there. Then in this area, these sort of coloured circles are various fish, seabirds, etc. And then you've got your plankton, detritivores, etc. right down the bottom. Sorry, plankton and detritus right down the bottom. So very, very complex interactions. And it's very difficult to experiment on this sort of thing in the wild to see what the impact will be. It's very unpredictable. But we are seeing more and more that there are these impacts when sharks are removed. Okay, moving on to that, sharks in Singapore. Now, I'm not going to give you a big species list. I mean, there are places you can look online, research papers you can look up for species lists. I just want to talk to you about a few of them that we've seen here. And I guess most of you, this is probably as close as you, or this is the only thing you know about sharks in Singapore, is when some news article appears, something like this, crocodiles and sharks in off woodlands. Sounds very dramatic. Or perhaps when you're walking around a wet market, okay, in Singapore. So you see sharks quite commonly in wet markets, for example, Tekka Market in Little India. They're quite often sharks that you'll see there if you walk around. But one thing we don't really know in Singapore is to what extent the sharks that we have here are resident and what extent they're transient. Okay, the reality is that fish don't respect national borders. Okay, in this area, you've got hundreds of different species of elasmobranchs, of sharks and rays. Okay, some of them will perhaps be living in Singapore their whole life. Others will be transient, either passing through on migratory pathways, perhaps chasing food and entering that way, or getting lost in some occasions. So we know that, however, that species that have been recorded in Singapore, that we are right in the middle of their home range in many cases. An example here. It's really rare in Singapore, a couple of sightings in sort of historical records. It is found in the South China Sea, though. So there's no reason whatsoever that this isn't passing through Singapore waters. So short-fin mako. Okay, fastest shark, up to about 74 kilometers an hour when it's really going for it. In terms of birth, so this is an example where you've got the young eating eggs, and they undergo seasonal migrations. And more recent research is indicating that the females are returned to the areas that they were when they were youngsters. So that might be a reason if there was a large population in Singapore at some stage, which maybe there wasn't because of the physical characteristics of the environment here. Us losing habitat, there's nowhere for these animals to come back to. This particular species sexually segregates. Okay, a lot of shark species, the males and females spend a lot of time apart. Now, this data here is from a research paper by Mesientes et al. In 2009. And this data that they've got is recorded from long-line fisheries. Okay, so actual fisheries are going out there specifically targeting these animals. So it's off the coast of South America. Each of these circles is a point where there's a catch of animals. The white dots on the left-hand side are the males. The black dots are females. So you can see actually in the open ocean here, we've got quite clear segregation of males and females. Now, there's various reasons for this. So some of the members of this team, for example, in the UK have been looking at this for a long time. It can be down to differences in food, differences in body size, differences in habitat requirements. It can be down to differences in terms of thermal regulation, the fact that females may work better at certain temperatures as opposed to males who work better biologically at other temperatures. There's a whole host of reasons behind this. This team found that this one wasn't down to food differences because they found that the males and females were pretty much eating the same thing. But what's interesting about that last case, I suppose, is the fact that if you've got females and males in different places, and if you've got fishing pressure occurring in those places, you may have real differences in terms of fishing impacts. That if you've got fishing concentrated in an area when there's only females, there's going to be a heavier impact on females than there is on males, which can lead to all sorts of issues. Okay, another fish that we're within the region where this is found. Okay, the whale shark. So usually about under 12 meters, usually offshore, though it does come into coastal areas. When there are plankton blooms, for example, when you've got coral spawning events, and there are other organisms spawning at the same time, lots of food available. And in terms of movement, so this is a study done in the Galapagos a few years ago. So we have the Galapagos Islands here. They satellite tagged some of these sharks, looked at their movement patterns over a period of time. I think it was up to about half a year. And they found that certain times of the year, the sharks move a couple of thousand kilometers out into the ocean from the Galapagos. Other times of the year, other season, they would basically go the different direction towards the open coast. Now, this kind of information is really important if you're looking at conserving species. You know, understanding the habitats and the areas that they're found in is really vital. Just deciding that, oh, we caught something there, so that's where we'll protect, is not the best way to go about things. And technology is really giving us this ability to understand animal movement and habitat use in ways that were, unthought of, 10 or 20 years ago. Before you get too excited, this is pretty much, as far as I know, the only sighting of a whale shark in Singapore back in the 1960s. So, they're in the region. There's no reason they couldn't be here. This one ended up here. Unfortunately, it got wrapped up in some aquaculture pens or fences, and these brave marine policemen shot it, 13 times with a Bren gun to kill the savage beast. So yeah, it has occurred here, it's been seen here. We're in the right region, but it's unlikely you'll ever see one, I would say. Something it may be more likely to come across, if there are any divers, for example, in the room, is the tawny nurse shark. This is found in continental areas and also coastal areas, down to sort of depths of at least 70 meters, but you find it much shallower on occasion. It mainly feeds at night, and it's feeding on fish, crustaceans, cephalopods, octopus, that sort of thing, and also laying eggs. And it has been seen in Singapore. It's been caught in Singapore. So this is an example, 2009, an individual caught off Changi. Doesn't look very happy there, but apparently this one was actually saved by a restaurant owner or a chef or someone who put the money forward and bought it and released it. And more recently, I was kind of astounded when I saw this a couple of years ago, this individual, which I guess was either caught, I imagine it's caught in Singapore waters or at least somewhere very close to Singapore, and then was introduced into the fishing pond at Pasir Ris for people to go fishing and plucking it out. So it's definitely found in the region, so you may well see it. But it's just trying to understand, though, whether it's resident, whether it's breeding here. We just know nothing about it. Another example of that, the zebra shark. Okay, so it's another inshore species. Again, mainly nocturnal. A lot of these species are. And feeding on the same sort of thing, mollusks, crustaceans, and fish. And it's egg laying. And again, being seen in Singapore. So this example here on the left-hand side, it's a picture, so it's caught off Changi, 2007. This individual was eaten, so it wasn't very lucky. The one on the right-hand side, this food blog in a wet market in Singapore in 2012. Obviously, we can't tell whether this came from Singapore or the regional waters outside of Singapore, but it's come from somewhere fairly close. So, they are present in Singapore waters. Whether they're resident or not, we just have no idea. Okay, type of sharks, the group of sharks, the requiem sharks. If you look at the records, a lot of different species have been sighted at one time or another in Singapore, including, believe it or not, this bull shark. Okay, most of them are likely to be visitors. Most of them are sort of ocean-going or travel long distances. This species, for example, covers up to 180 kilometers in 24 hours when people looked at tagging studies. So they could easily be sort of shooting through Singapore or past Singaporean waters. In terms of females and breeding, It's quite nasty with these animals. The females often have breeding scars. And recently, found in Singapore, not a very big one, luckily. So 2012, basically this individual swam into the dry docks up at Sembawang. When the dry docks were drained, the shark obviously didn't do very well. But you know that they are spotted here. Now looking at the same group, the requiem shark still, the black-tipped reef shark. This is much more common in Singapore. Okay, a lot of examples, people seeing it in the outer islands, for example. In some places you find people have recorded that the juveniles tend to spend a lot of time in mangrove areas and in seagrass areas, moving in with the high tide and out when the tide drops. And in terms of litter sizes, this is one that produces very few pups. It's about 2 to 4 pups when it breeds. And as I said, it's spotted around Singapore quite regularly. If you look at dive blogs or fishing blogs or any of the nature blogs in Singapore, it's quite often sightings. And quite often the sightings are of neonates, so newborns, or small juveniles. So it appears that this species is resident here, that it's actually breeding within Singapore. Now, if you look at some of the research that's going on, this is research conducted by a colleague of mine over in Townsville at our main campus called Andrew Chu. And basically, he grew up in Singapore, but he works over in Australia. And this was some tracking work done. These acoustic tags, which I'll tell you more about in a minute, they tracked animals from this area here, Cleveland Bay, which is off Townsville, off the Queensland coast, the Great Barrier Reef's out here. Tracked these juveniles over time and found that basically they moved from these coastal areas in sort of out to the reef once they get to a certain age. What was interesting is they actually tagged not just the juveniles but also females and males, and they found that these adult females and adult males, and they found that they were spending most of their time Andrew Chin, my mistake. Most of their time within Cleveland Bay. The females were spending most of the time there. The males would only visit there on occasion. They also found that juveniles here weren't really using the seagrass and mangroves in the same way as been seen elsewhere, but they seem to be there in this very turbid water. Now, if you think about Singaporean waters, there's probably nowhere more turbid and murky in terms of coastal seawater than Singapore. So, there may be something very similar happening here. Okay, the next group of really common sharks in Singapore. What are the bamboo sharks? Again, they're spotted a lot. So, go from the top here, we've got the grey bamboo shark, the slender bamboo shark, white spotted bamboo shark, and the brown banded bamboo shark. All species that have been recorded in Singapore. Anyone here who goes fishing, probably catch them at some stage, either around the southern islands or perhaps off the coast of Changi and close to Pulau Ubin. Regularly caught by fishers, seen by divers, and I'm sort of trying to start tapping into information from divers and fishers. If any of you here are involved in those activities, it'd be great to talk to you, just to hear about where you're seeing these sort of animals. In terms of what they're doing, so we find species all the time, and there are occasional research papers coming out. In terms of behaviour, really intricate mating behaviour in this species, or in this group of species. So here we have one where the male basically grasps hold of the pectoral fin of the female, and then they both go into like a vertical headstand position. They then mate, and then they drop off and kind of lie beside each other for a while until they eventually go their separate ways. So kind of really sort of intricate mating behaviour. Now, one of the reasons to look at sharks as an ecologist and as someone interested in behaviour is the fact that the brain to body sort of mass ratio is very similar, at least for these animals, to sort of small mammals. So in terms of behaviour, you do see similar sorts of behaviour in these organisms. Here we have an egg case of a bamboo shark again. And what we have here, so a lot of sharks exhibit what we call electroreception behaviour. Okay? They can actually detect electric currents of their prey. So there are some species that feed on organisms, feed on crabs and shrimps, etc., that may burrow in mud or sand. If they're swimming across the top of the mud or the sand, they can actually sense the electric field of their prey item and catch it. Now, something interesting with the egg cases of these animals, oops, this works, is that we just see the same sort of thing happening. Even when they're in embryo, they can still sense electric current. In this case, it appears to be predators, and the behavior changes in a way that makes them less obvious to predators. So what you'll see here is you'll see an egg case with an embryo in it. So at the moment the electric field is off, so you can see the animal breathing. But look what happens when it turns on. Yeah. So it's sensing the electric current, its movement basically ceases. For I think, what was that, 8 seconds. Okay, so really sort of interesting behavior that we're seeing here. Okay, which brings me up to what I'm doing. So I've worked on cat sharks before in the UK, which are a similar sort of size animal to bamboo sharks. But I've recently got some funding. Well, I've got a project started, which is partially funded by Wildlife Reserve Singapore. I'm hoping to work with get some students here out doing some field work with me, students from RP, and also working a little bit with national parks as well. And what I want to do is look at these bamboo sharks in Singaporean waters. I want to look at the distribution patterns and the biology of them. Even though they're common, the reality is we don't know much about them. So the objectives of my project are to look at local distribution patterns, particularly of the slender bamboo shark, because even though that's common sort of in the Asia-Pacific region, there are fisheries that catch this animal off India. We know very little about it. I want to look at key sort of biological data in terms of population structure, in terms of diet, and also look at movement patterns and habitat use by this animal. I guess one question is, why bother even looking at bamboo sharks? Well, I guess one reason in Singapore is the fact that we signed up to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And part of being part of that convention is that we have sort of promised, we've stated that we'll develop strategies to both conserve our biodiversity and also sustainably use our biodiversity. And we know very little about marine fish in Singapore and around Singapore. I said it's common as a species, it's common locally, it's common out of Southeast Asia. There's almost no information whatsoever on it. We don't know how long they live for. We don't know really what they're consuming. We don't know the kind of habitat they're using, apart from it may be sort of soft and sandy areas. So in order, if you're trying to manage species like this for conservation purposes, or you're trying to manage species like this for fisheries purposes, not having even this most basic data means that you're just shooting in the dark. So a few things. What I'll do is I've got some kit and stuff up here at the front. Later on, after Kathy's talked and answered any questions you have, people are interested to see how this stuff works and how I'll actually do this can come and have a look at the equipment and have a go at tagging my fake furry shark. But in the meantime, basic stuff. So catching these animals, looking at lengths, getting an idea in terms of differences in population structure in different areas of Singapore. Getting an idea of diet. Okay, this group are interesting because of the fact their teeth are hinged. So if they're consuming fish, the teeth are hinged outwards, so they're basically pinning the fish with their sharp teeth. If they're consuming crustaceans, they're flattened, so they're most grinding plates. But the way that people normally look at fish diet is you catch a fish, you kill it, you take out the stomach, you dissect it, and have a look at what's in there. What you can do with these animals is you can use what we call gastric lavage or gastric lavage, where you catch the animal, you pump a bit of seawater into their stomach, you make them vomit, you collect the vomit, and then you let them go on their merry way. Okay, so it's a non-destructive way, and using this non-lethal method, you can look at what types of food they're eating. You can understand more about how important different types of food are to them, and also you can use what we call stable isotope analysis on some of those samples to figure out where they fit in the food chain and how important they may be to other organisms. Something else that's important is understanding movement patterns. So as I said, if you want to try and manage for sort of conservation or fisheries purposes, knowing where animals are is really important. Not just where you catch them, but where they produce their young, where their key feeding grounds are. And one way of doing this is tagging them. Now, I said you can have a go, so I've got a tagging gun here for later on after Kathy's talk. Here is a particularly unhappy flying shark, I think, but it's been tagged there. Basically, by putting a number tag on, what happens, we release a shark, we've tagged it. If someone catches it again, it's got an individual number. We can determine where it's been caught, so how far it's traveled. We can measure it and figure out how much it's grown since the period it was last caught and released. So sort of basic, but really important information. Now the tags look something a bit like this. Okay, they have numbers on them, and it's a real sort of tried and tested method. Also, what I'll be doing is what is acoustic tracking. So I'm sure you've all sort of seen on TV and on nature movies where someone's tracking a wolf through the mountains or whatever, and they've got a radio collar and they're tracking it with sort of a radio antenna. It's a similar sort of idea, but radio waves don't travel very well through seawater, so it's slightly different technology. But by putting acoustic tags on individuals, you can look at more fine-scale movements. Now, there's two ways of doing this. So initially what I'll be doing is I'll be going and manually tracking them, hopefully with some volunteers. Now, the likelihood is that most of these species are nocturnal, or they'll be more active at night, so there'll be lots of sort of out there on a small boat at night, getting rained on, etc. But what this method enables you to do is really figure out where exactly these fish are, and then from that figure out what kind of habitat they're mainly using. Later on, what I hope to do, when I get some more funding, is to stick out some receivers. Okay, and what receivers do is pretty much the same thing as this, except it's a fixed receiver, and every time a fish that's got a tag in, a coded tag, each tag has an individual code. Every time one swims past, your receiver will record the fact that it's there. So it gives you much longer term, and you can cover sort of larger areas. Or if you want to concentrate in a particular area and see how often a shark is coming back to that area, or if it stays there for many, many months, you can use this technology. Also part of this project is, as I said, stakeholder engagement. It's working with you to try and get more information. So one way, as I said, if there's fishers and divers, you're a really important resource for information for researchers. You're out there a lot more than we are in many cases, and any tips and sightings you can give us are really beneficial. Also, if you're just visiting, say, a supermarket and you see that there are live bamboo sharks in the tanks, that would also be useful information. So I produced this website. This is the link here. I've also written up on the board for later on, and I need your help. So what this is, you can go onto here, and anytime you sight these animals, you can put information, enter the information there. That will automatically get sent to me, and so I can start producing a database. Now, this is just the beginning of this research program. Now, what I'm really hoping to do in the future is, after this sort of first year, is to go a bit further than the website and develop an app with collaborators, because I have no idea how to do that. But develop an app, so not just bamboo sharks, but any sightings of sharks anywhere in Singapore, people will be able to enter the information there, and we'll be able to build a database on sharks and sightings in Singapore. Also, so I want to start beginning to deploy these sort of acoustic receivers. So there's receivers which can record a shark going past to more constantly measure the movement of sharks around Singapore. I'm also thinking big. We can all dream. Okay, at the moment, there's a big push in Singapore to understand more about our marine environment. Okay, a lot of research is being funded at the moment at various universities here. And I think that, as I said, fish don't respect national borders. And I think it's really important that Singapore, we get a grasp of which species are resident, which species are passing through. Because even if we're just a transit point for species of fish, we may still be vitally important. If you think about birds, there's sort of a flyway. So you have birds migrating all the way from the southern hemisphere up through Singapore, up to Russia and beyond. We may have similar things happen with sharks, we just don't know. So what I would love to see in the future, what I'm dreaming of, would be a curtain, an acoustic curtain. We could ring the whole of Singapore with these acoustic receivers, and they would be available to researchers, not just looking at sharks, but people looking at other marine organisms. And if you tag them, it'll be open to everyone, and where we could get a real idea in terms of what's happening with animal movement. Australia's done this, and Australia's massive. If Australia can do this, it should be readily achievable in Singapore. Also, the beauty of these sort of systems is the fact that they're widely used internationally. And if say, we had a Singapore receiver, and we pick up a fish that isn't the code of one of the tags we've put in Singapore, we can send that information to sort of some international, international groups, basically the company themselves, and also there's some groups in Australia who will then disseminate that information out. It'll get back to the researcher who tagged the animal wherever they may have tagged it in the world. So I think there is that potential here for real international sort of understanding of where Singapore fits into things in terms of sharks and other marine organisms. Okay, I'll leave it there. As I said, after Kathy's talk, I've got an acoustic tag and a receiver down the front here. I've got a tagging gun, and I've got my little furry shark. So what I'd like to do is, if anyone's interested, I'll show you how we actually go about and do this sort of stuff. I think that's it. Okay, I'll leave it there. And these are some links. These links are really useful to get you started. Got me started anyway in Singapore, seeing what was here. Also, this book, if you're interested in sharks in Singapore, actually identifying them yourselves, it's a really good guide to help get you started. Okay, thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.